Hello, my name is Alba and the channel name is Seriela, and I was not going to do this today. I'm going to do my vlog, part one of the vlog that I did on judging the quarterfinals for the nonfiction group, whatever I will put it in. I was going to do it later, but as I was doing my chores, I listened to some Booktube, and Greg of Supposedly Fun, his video came on, and I realized he, Kazen, and I were in the same group. And I can't watch his video until I put up mine, because I don't want to accidentally repeat something that he says, right? So I'm dying to see his, and I'm dying to see Kazen and to compare notes. So I better get mine up, because I did a vlog. I don't know how it's going to come out, but it's genuine, authentic responses to the 6 nonfiction books in this round of the quarterfinals. So here we go. Thursday, April 9th, and I read a little bit more of The Only Plane in the Sky, and the chapters that had to do with the evacuation of the 2 towers after the 2 planes hit the World Trade Center, George Bush's reading with the school children in Florida, the evacuation of the White House, where Dick Cheney was, and a few other of the top officials. Then there was the section about Flight 77, which was the flight that crashed into the Pentagon. There were quite a few interviews there with people who were at the Pentagon at the time, plus family members of passengers that were on that plane. When I got to the chapter about the evacuation of the World Trade Center, that was where I decided, no more audiobook, can't do it. It's as if somebody was reading the stage directions for a play out loud. And so from now on, I'm just going to stick with the ebook, where I can, skip those stage directions. Then I got to the flight 93 in Pennsylvania, and got up to chapter 21, which is the FAA, where the FAA stops all flights, canceled all flights and told everyone to land wherever they were, to land at the closest airport. That's how the reading is going. I'm going to add The Heartbeat of Wounded Knee, which is also, I have it on the Kindle, because that's a long one, and I'm going to need the time to read that. The Only Plane in the Sky, after the evacuation of the 2 towers, the crash of the airplane into the Pentagon, and this is a book that is full of details, very dense, lots of facts, and comprehensive in the sense that it follows a chronological order, but there were so many things happening at the same time during that chronology. What was happening at the White House, what was happening at the Pentagon, what was happening in Florida, where President Bush was, Oh, and the reactions from around the world. The family members, for example, of the passengers and family members of people who were in the towers at the time and in the other buildings that were affected by the attacks. Yeah, another thing that always impresses me is unforgettable are the firemen, and also there's a special mention of the security guards in the private security company that were on that day. And somebody mentions that they're the unsung heroes of 9/11 because they didn't run away. And somebody mentions this was way beyond their pay grade, but they stayed. As if dignity and heroism have to do with pay grades. Yeah. Another comment about the security guards. Guys who are only making about 25 grand a year, not one ran. They never blinked. Okay, which is actually what's happening with the pandemic. Right? People who are barely surviving economically and financially are the ones who are putting their lives on the line. So yeah, the times that people express how similar it seemed to a war zone when they evacuated the two towers. Also, the sounds. There were parts of the narrative in which different people describing how they perceived the sounds of the towers collapsing, of victims falling, of the crash, and then the absence of sound as the building collapsed. Very, very interesting. How the commander at the Northeastern Air Defense Sector, the NEADS, were used to protecting the shores because they were getting ready to do, they were going to do a kamikaze mission, and they were contemplating crashing into Flight 93 when they realized that that was a plane that had been hijacked. And these particular aircraft at the Northeast Air Defense Sector were not armed, but they were willing to fly and crash into Flight 93, weighing a lot of ethical questions. Not that they didn't contemplate what they were doing. And one of the pilots specifically was debating, the lives of the more against the life of the few, the lives of the few. So they were used to protecting the shores of the United States, way out overseas. No radars were ever pointing towards the United States. Anything within the United States was considered friendly by definition. That was before 9/11. So this points to the magnitude of what those hijackers had done. Because before all radar, it was just taken for granted that none of that could occur within the confines of the continental United States. That was just something that had not been contemplated before. I hadn't even thought, one of the National Guard pilots said, I hadn't even thought about what that kind of mission might be like on American soil. On American soil. And no one had ever contemplated the need to shoot down a civilian airliner with passengers. 15th of April. But this time I want to talk about The Heartbreak of Wounded Knee by David Treuer. And I took down all my notes so that I can talk to you guys about it. And have documentation of what I think about this book. Very dense book, almost 600 pages, which is why I want to start it now so that I'll be sure to finish before the Booktube, this round of the Booktube Prize is over. Right from the prologue, it captivated me and engaged me because in the prologue he goes into very detailed account of why, the reasons why he wrote this book. And because he wants to talk about Indian life rather than Indian death, like Dee Brown's book, Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee. And I was scandalized because that book marked my youth. So I'm going to be looking out for, yes, exactly that. How this book centers on Native American life and their accomplishments and the survival of the civilization, because it captivates me. It captivates me. There are things that resonate with me as a Puerto Rican reading this book. Talks about General Miles, who was the general in charge of the troops that fought at the massacre of Wounded Knee, and later on was the general that invaded Puerto Rico. The author goes on to say that he wants to communicate in this book what he loves about Native American life, and why communicating that counter narrative is so important to him. Talks about his father as a survivor of the Holocaust and why his father decided to live on the Indian reservation and become a part of that community. He talks about why he decided, the author decided to go into anthropology, and even mentions how anthropology and that science, how it was part and parcel of colonization and dealings with colonized people, right? And how the science of anthropology went through a series of reckonings with its own colonial past, and how he considers not only the personal as political, but also the political as personal. So I'm going to be looking out for how he accomplishes the objective that he talks about in his prologue. It is so he describes this book as a mixture of journalism, reportage, history, and personal stories of others and of himself. Part one, after this prologue comes part one, which is titled Narrating the Apocalypse, right, from 10,000 BCE to 1890. So he's calling all of that span of history the apocalypse. Yeah. Talks about the early tribes, talks about colonization, and, you know, very firmly sets out that no, nobody discovered anybody. They met, the people who invaded Native American soil met people who already had a culture, rich culture, and some even advanced civilizations. and how the colonizers followed a pattern of disease, pandemic, anybody? Disease, slavery, starvation, and disruption of Native American life. Talks about Thomas Jefferson, how he contemplated getting rid of the Indian population in the southeast United States by indebting them. I'm telling you, I'm identifying a whole lot in this book. He planned to disappear the Indians in the southeast by getting the trading houses to get influential individuals in the Native American community in debt, get them into debt, because we observe that when these debts get beyond what individuals can pay, they become willing to lop off the debt by cession of lands. Yeah. Then he didn't get to do that at that time, Jefferson. That was left for Andrew Jackson to do. And he did, despite the fact that the Supreme Court invalidated Georgia's claim and affirmed the rights of the Indians, declaring their removal illegal. But Jackson didn't care and removed them anyway. Yeah, so I'm going to leave it at that. That's where I am right now in part one. So continuing, today is Thursday, April 23rd, and I'm continuing with this blog, Heartbeat at Wounded Knee. And interesting how he organizes this book. He organizes the book by regions. This first part, in which he is talking about the apocalypse from 10,000 BC all the way to 1890, he goes about it by regions. And yeah, so he starts off with the Seminole Wars, which is like in the southeast of the United States, continues on with the Southwest, and then with California, then the Pacific Northwest, then the Great Basin, and then the Southern Great Plains. And in each of those regions, he goes about talking about that early prehistoric development of those tribes and those cultures and civilizations, all the way down through the colonial period and then the American colonization. Still haven't really seen any evidence of what he wanted to bring out in this book, which is Indian life versus Indian death. So far, I've seen a lot of dissemination, a lot of forced resettlement of the Indians, especially in the aftermath of the Seminole Wars, and what they did in the Great Basin, for example, and the Pacific Northwest. Yeah, a lot of destruction, disease especially. Talk about that in this time of pandemic. Yeah, lots of smallpox, measles, syphilis, even chlamydia, claiming Indian lives, not to mention attacks by the military and by Mormons. Oh, yeah. But I'm still waiting to see the grander objective of Indian life versus Indian death, that counter narrative that Treuer wanted to manifest in this book. So yeah, that's what I read up to around 40% in to the book now. And I also continued this morning, I continued reading The Only Plane in the Sky, and this time I told you that I had left off reading last week the part of the plane crash, plane 93. This to me, this is a masterful example. It's a masterful work of organization, because he is trying to portray in chronological order, the events of that tragic day from many different perspectives, and from the oral history, the testimony of people who were there, people who had experienced it. And as someone who was living in New York City at the time, I marvel at all the tiny little bits and pieces and details that I'm learning now through reading this book. So, this is going to be a very difficult ranking so far, just between these two books. Yeah, so today is Monday, the 26th, I think. 26 or 27, Monday. And I'm still worked all weekend on the two Booktube prize things that I'm working on. The Only Plane in the Sky, once I went full-on ebook instead of with the audiobook, it's been flowing and reading very fast. And despite the fact that it's all oral history, right? Very few interruptions or clarifications by the author. Whenever the author comes in, it's for good cause, and to clarify situations and explain what's going on in the chronology of that day, 9/11. So that has been very easy and captivating reading, for sure. But Heartbeat is plodding along, because frankly, I've been waiting for what he calls examples of Indian life and Indian resistance and resiliency, and but it's been a full-on litany of the abuses of the United States government against the tribes in all ways, shapes, and forms. Militarily, economically, culturally, the boarding schools, the massacres, the allotments, the congressional laws enacted to take away tribal lands and split up tribes, and frankly, you know, I've been frustrated because I'm waiting and waiting and waiting for what he promised to be examples of Indian life. Of course, I'm only like a third of a way through the book, not even halfway through. It's taken me a long time. As a matter of fact, I dedicated yesterday all day, Sunday, just on that book, because I was determined to get to a part in which, the part that he promised. So I finally got to the part where it says Indian resistance, I think it is. Let's see, I got my notes right here. Yeah, I've been taking notes, which is another reason why it's been taking me a long time. It says, finally, Indian life. the seeds of tribal resistance. And he's only given about 2 or 3 examples so far. He gives is the resistance by the Ojibwe tribe, and how that was a fantastic example. You know, that was uplifting and countered my frustration and my depression up to this point, because the Ojibwe tribe had a united, strong leadership, and they went united against all the agents and the commissioners who were trying to take away their land. And they were very strategic in their resistance because they were not all or nothing. So yeah, and he gives good examples of that. So now I finally got to part 3. And part 3 is like a complete change of perspective, because here he gets very personal and starts off with a story about his cousin. So yeah, that's where I am now with this complete shift in from historical, the historical aspects of Indian strife and suffering, and now to present day contemporary Indian life and very personal accounts of his family. So that's where I am right now. Hi, today's Thursday. Thursday, last day of April. I really want to get those 2 Booktube books finished. If not by today, by this weekend. It's been a busy morning. I've been up since 3 o'clock in the morning, and as soon as I had my coffee, sat down and continued reading Heartbeat at Wounded Knee. I had thought that he was going to go into more contemporary personal stories. And the personal story of his cousin Sam, who fought with, he did wrestling, that served as a launching point to go back into the history of Indians in the military in all the wars. And so it served as a continuation of the history. And with that continuation of the history of Indians now in the military during wartime, lots of examples of bravery and sacrifices and all sorts of valor and medals. Of course, the Navajo code talkers and other tribes whose languages were used to foil enemy sabotage intents. Yeah. But with that history, was also the abuses that continued. A lot of sad stories of veterans coming back to more abuse and more poverty and alcoholism and things like that. But, gotta give it to him. Almost at the halfway point of the book, he finally got to the message that he wants to convey, that despite the abuse, despite the robbery of their land, despite the disrespect to the culture, and just the tragedy of Indian life in the past, the fact that the Indian continues to live and to survive on the Indian person's own terms, whatever those terms may be. The fact that the Indian is still here is what is cause for celebration of Indian life. Finally got to that point on page 244, I think it is. Almost halfway into the book. So yeah, I'm feeling a lot better because I wasn't seeing this great distinction up to this point from this book and Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee. So yeah, that'll be it for today. Yesterday, at night, I finished, at last, The Only Plane in the Sky. This was a huge, huge collaboration, as the author says at the end of the book. Now, what surprised me was that around the 70% point, because I was reading it digitally, at the 70% point, the epilogue starts, which means that most of the book takes only around 70%, the text itself. The rest of the 30 to 25% of the book is taken up with what they call a reading group guide, which is just an interview with the author, the image credits, the index, the acknowledgments. The acknowledgments take a big chunk. And I read the acknowledgments. He acknowledges a tremendous amount of people. This was a huge collaboration to be able to capture the span of that day, 9/11. The epilogue has snippets of what occurred after 9/11 in terms of safety restrictions, how people view 9/11 at the 1-year mark, at the 10-year mark. Even though the text was only 70% of the book, the other part is so valuable because the reading of the interview with the author fleshes out the whole process, how the book came about, interesting chance encounter with the pilot of Air Force One, the author's background, what gives him expertise in this field. Just fantastic book. Unforgettable. No idea. In the acknowledgments, he especially is grateful to another oral historian who he collaborated in great part with. Somebody who he says is stamped in every part of this book because she's a person who compiled and cataloged a lot of these oral histories. And her name was Jenny Pachuki of the National September 11th Museum. So that's all. Okay, so today is Thursday, May 7th, and I'm plugging away at The Heartbeat of Wounded Knee. And I think I finally realized why it's so very, very hard for me to continue with this book. First of all, I had very high expectations for this book because of the promises that the author made from the very beginning, distinguishing it from Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee, which was a book that I remember devastated me. It just wounded me, no pun intended. And so as per his indications at the beginning of the book, I'm expecting something entirely different, and I'm not getting it. This has been like a prolongation of the devastation of that other book, Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee, except that there's more history to it. It doesn't end at Wounded Knee. The offenses, the oppression, the atrocities just keep on happening with total impunity and with the support of the federal government. I am getting the sense of what he's trying to accomplish here, that Indians survived, many in different ways, but as they wanted to, according to their own conditions, given the horrible conditions that in which they had to do this. In other words, that the political is personal and the personal is political. Yeah. Even now, when he is mixing personal anecdotes having to do with family members, like his cousins, his uncles, his friends, as examples of how some Indians have coped and have survived and have even thrived, some. Not many, but some. Yeah. I haven't finished yet. I'm holding out hope that I can finally understand what it is that he meant at the beginning, that he was going to showcase Indian life. This hits home for me. He is talking about hundreds of years of oppression and colonization. Yeah, we here on the island can identify with that. I can identify with that. And so I am still searching for that hope that was promised at the beginning of the book. That's all I can say. Okay, so today is Saturday. I've spent the whole day reading Heartbeat at Wounded Knee. And it's taking me so long. Finally broke the 400 page mark, and it's 500 and something pages. And these are all my notes. I'm still learning to deal with digital books. And frankly, sometimes this book makes me doze. It's like a combination of coronavirus anxiety and sleep patterns that have, completely discombobulated. And so it's been hard to focus on this book. Very dense, lots of details, but it's something that speaks to me very much. I wish I didn't have to, I didn't feel as if I was plodding along, trudging, that it's like an ordeal to get through. But sometimes it is. And from what I've read so far, gone through Ames, yeah, he has very strong opinions about the American Indian movement of the 70s. Yeah. And I'm getting more of a feel of what Treuer, the author, perceives as success in Indian life. Just got to a wonderful section in which he speaks about the importance of language in culture, and especially to the continuance of ceremonial life and religion, and how intergenerational strife and intergenerational abuse can affect the continuation of language, especially if younger people have no interest because of their resentments and their trauma after intergenerational abuse. Yeah, very, very interesting. But I've spent all day at 6 o'clock. I'm punching out for today and hope to finish by tomorrow so I can get to the other books. Okay, so today is Tuesday, and I finished finally Heartbeat yesterday in the afternoon, and it delivered. I might not have written it with the same style, and I might not have taken so long to go about it, but I was satisfied with the final message. And yeah, I would recommend it. Okay, off to read the next ones. Bye. Today is Thursday, May 14th, and yesterday, after finishing Heartbeat, I immediately started Woman of No Importance, which is about a female spy, one of the first female spies during World War II, Virginia Hall, if I'm not mistaken. And in contrast to the grueling pace of Heartbeat at Wounded Knee, this reads like butter. This is thrilling, suspenseful, inspiring, can hardly put it down. I'm at the halfway mark, I think, and it's just captivating, learning a lot about World War II, things that I, did not know. Plus, this woman was genius. She was one of a kind, which makes it very interesting. And the style of writing just flows, despite the fact that the author does use, and it's based on a foundation of lots of sources, classified, declassified. Yeah, she did her homework. But the narrative flow is just, as I said, like butter. And I can't wait to finish. I hope I finish it by tomorrow. And yeah. And then I have 3 other books to go through for the Booktube prize. Ciao. Yeah, so today is Saturday, May the 16th. And I've just finished this morning, 1 hour ago, reading A Woman of No Importance, about French resistance fighter Virginia Hall, who was working first for the British, although she was American. Then after the war, she worked for the OSS, which was the precursor of the CIA. I cried. I cried at the end, and I don't know how I am going to rank these 3 books, because, and not even thinking about the other ones, because if they're as good as these 3 books have been, yeah, I don't know how that's going to happen, the ranking. But this book was, as I said before, a very compelling, compulsive read, easy to read, just suspenseful, thrilling story about this very intelligent, resourceful, brilliant, courageous freedom fighter. A woman who was working with a prosthetic leg. Yeah, and didn't let that hamper her in the least. Yeah, don't want to give out any spoilers, but it was a tremendously exciting read, and I'm happy to have read it. Oh boy.
going to be a tough decision.